In October 1823, a group of fur trappers trudged along the edge of Shadow Creek. The air was thick and damp, carrying the faint scent of decaying leaves and wet earth. Their journey had been arduous, but the promise of fresh game and unclaimed territory kept them pressing forward. The leader of the group, Marcus Vane, a stern and pragmatic man, halted abruptly, raising his hand to silence the others. Before them lay an abandoned campsite. The fire pit, lined with blackened stones, still held the remnants of charred wood, but no smoke rose to the sky. A scattering of tools and personal belongings lay half buried in the mud. The scene was unsettling, as if whoever had been here had vanished in haste. "What do you make of it, Marcus?" asked Warren, the youngest and most curious of the group, his voice quivering. "Raiders, maybe," Marcus muttered, though his tone betrayed doubt. As they sifted through the campsite, Sam Calloway, a wiry man with sharp eyes, uncovered something peculiar. Beneath a sodden beaver pelt, he found a journal, its leather cover cracked and weathered. He opened it, revealing pages filled with frenzied handwriting. "It's someone's account," Sam said, his voice hushed. "Looks like they were trappers too." Marcus took the journal, his eyes narrowing as he read the first few entries aloud. It chronicled the journey of a man named Elias Granger, who, along with his companions, had ventured into this very area the previous autumn. The entries grew darker with each page, describing strange occurrences and an overwhelming sense of dread that plagued their party. One line stood out, scrawled in uneven, desperate strokes. "The woods will not let us leave." The first journal entry detailed a seemingly ordinary beginning. Elias and his group had arrived at the forest's edge, pitching their camp near the riverbank. For the first few days, the hunting had been plentiful, and spirits were high. But on the fourth day, things began to unravel. Elias described an oppressive silence that fell over the forest, a silence so profound it made every snap of a twig sound deafening. The animals, once abundant, seemed to vanish, leaving behind only their tracks. At night, an icy wind would sweep through the trees, carrying with it whispers too faint to understand but too persistent to ignore. The journal recounted the group's decision to move downstream after the game had thinned. But as they traveled, something inexplicable happened. By mid-afternoon, they came upon a wall of dense, towering pine trees. The sight was disconcerting. The trees grew so close together that their twisted branches wove into an almost impenetrable barrier. When the group finally pushed through the pines, they emerged into a clearing and froze. Before them was the same campsite they had left that morning, down to the still smoking fire they had extinguished hours earlier. "This is impossible," one of the men had muttered, his voice shaking. Elias's account captured the growing tension among the group. Some argued it was a mistake, they must have somehow doubled back. But others, like their leader, Abram Holt, dismissed the idea outright. "We followed the river downstream," Abram had insisted. "It's not possible to end up here again." That night, the oppressive silence deepened. Elias described hearing soft footsteps circling their camp, though no one could see anything beyond the flickering firelight. A low, guttural sound, half growl, half moan, echoed from the forest. The men huddled closer to the flames, muskets in hand, but nothing emerged from the darkness. The following morning, the group resolved to leave the cursed clearing behind. This time, they decided to go upstream, hoping to find a tributary that would lead them out of the area. But the journey proved fruitless. Hours later, they found themselves standing before the same wall of pine trees. "This can't be," Abram whispered, his confidence wavering for the first time. The men skirted the trees, walking west until they reached the base of a hill. Climbing it, they hoped to get their bearings, but what they saw from the summit chilled them to the bone. The wall of pines stretched endlessly in both directions, encircling them like a prison. The journal entry ended abruptly, with a single line that sent a shiver down Marcus's spine. "Something is watching us." The second journal entry opened with chaos. Elias recounted the growing unease among the group as their attempts to leave Shadow Creek failed again and again. No matter which direction they chose, they always ended up circling back to the same cursed clearing. That morning, the men argued over what to do next. Abram, the once steady leader, had grown irritable and short-tempered, snapping at every suggestion. Sam began mumbling to himself, his eyes darting toward the trees as though he saw things the others could not. Warren, the youngest of the group, broke the tense silence. "We're being hunted," he said, his voice trembling. "Don't be ridiculous," Abram barked, though his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. Warren shook his head. "I saw something last night. A figure, just beyond the firelight. It wasn't an animal." The group dismissed his claims, though uneasily, and decided to press further upstream. Yet as the sun rose higher, the forest seemed to shift around them. The once familiar landmarks became unrecognizable, the river curved in unnatural ways, and the trees appeared to close in, their branches forming grotesque shapes that resembled grasping hands. By the next day, the group was on edge. Elias described how the forest seemed to breathe, the air thick and heavy, carrying faint, indistinguishable whispers. The whispers grew louder at night, mingling with the sound of footsteps that never revealed their source. Tensions within the group reached a boiling point when Sam vanished. They had been walking in single file along the riverbank when they realized he was no longer with them. "Sam!" Abram shouted, his voice echoing through the oppressive silence. The group searched frantically, retracing their steps. They found no sign of Sam, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. That night, the whispers grew louder, accompanied by the sound of something dragging through the underbrush. The men huddled around the fire, muskets clutched tightly in their hands. Elias wrote, "The whispers are no longer faint. They call our names." The following morning, the group awoke to find strange markings carved into the trees surrounding their camp. The symbols were jagged and crude, yet disturbingly deliberate. "Who did this?" Abram demanded, but the men shook their heads. "We didn't hear anything," Warren whispered, his face pale. Elias described the chilling realization that the markings formed a circle around their camp, as though trapping them. Desperation set in. Abram, now visibly shaken, declared that they would head east, deeper into the forest, in hopes of finding an escape. As they moved, the forest grew darker, the canopy so dense it blotted out the sun. The air grew colder, and an unnatural mist began to seep through the trees, curling around their legs like grasping fingers. Elias's next entry was fragmented, as though written in haste. He described a figure that began to appear in the mist, a tall, shadowy silhouette with unnaturally long limbs. It did not move but seemed to watch them, its presence suffocating. Warren was the first to break. He dropped his musket and bolted into the forest, screaming incoherently. The others gave chase, but the mist thickened, obscuring their path. When they finally found Warren, he was kneeling by the river, his back to them. "Warren?" Marcus had called out, his voice trembling. Elias wrote, "He turned to face us, but it was not Warren anymore." His eyes were gone, and his mouth twisted into a smile that did not belong to him. Before anyone could react, Warren lunged at Abram, his movements unnaturally fast. The struggle was brief but brutal, ending with Abram plunging his hunting knife into Warren's chest. As Warren collapsed, the shadowy figure in the mist disappeared, leaving only silence. With two of their party now gone, the remaining men, Abram, Elias, and another named Caleb, were consumed by dread. They no longer spoke of escape but simply trudged onward, hoping to survive another day. Abram, Elias, and Caleb barely spoke. The forest no longer resembled a natural place, its trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their bark etched with patterns that looked like screaming faces. The air felt thick and suffocating, carrying a stench of decay that clung to their lungs. Abram took the lead, but his steps became increasingly erratic, as though chasing something unseen. Caleb muttered prayers under his breath, his gaze darting to every shadow. Elias's writing in the journal grew disjointed, the scrawl of a man losing his grip on reality. One night, they made camp near a clearing. The silence around them was oppressive, even the fire's crackling seemed subdued. Then the whispers began, no longer faint but loud and menacing, like a chorus of voices speaking a language none of them understood. "They're inside my head," Caleb whispered, clutching his temples. Abram barked, "Get a hold of yourself." But the fear in his voice betrayed his words. Elias described in the journal how Caleb stood abruptly, his movements stiff and unnatural. "Caleb, where are you going?" Abram yelled, but Caleb didn't answer. He vanished into the forest, swallowed by the shadows. Moments later, a scream ripped through the air, so raw and agonized that it made the men freeze. They found Caleb's musket on the forest floor, its surface coated in a sticky, black residue. Abram and Elias fled, abandoning everything in their desperation to escape. But the forest closed in around them. The mist grew thicker, cold and clammy, clinging to their skin like unseen hands. And then, the figure appeared again, closer this time, its form darker, more defined. Abram, trembling, fired his musket at the figure. The shot echoed through the forest, but the entity didn't flinch. Instead, it advanced, deliberate and unrelenting. "Run!" Abram shouted, shoving Elias forward before turning to face the shadow. Elias ran, his breath ragged, his vision blurred with tears. Behind him, Abram's screams broke through the night, followed by an eerie, unnatural silence. Elias wrote the final entries in the journal with shaky, almost illegible handwriting. Alone now, he described the forest as alive, branches clawed at him, roots moved beneath his feet, and the whispers became a ceaseless cacophony, blurring the line between external sounds and his own thoughts. When he stumbled back to the clearing where they had first camped, he found a horrifying sight, a crude altar made of bones and twisted branches. On it lay Abram's hunting knife, its blade slick with fresh blood. The last journal entry was chilling in its brevity.
"They are coming. This forest is theirs. If anyone finds this, leave. Do not search for me. Do not look for us. Shadow Creek does not let go."
The writing ended there, the final page smeared with what appeared to be blood. The group reading the journal huddled in stunned silence, the journal clutched in trembling hands. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying a mournful wail. The shadows in the camp seemed to shift, their flickers too deliberate to be caused by the fire. "We should leave," Sam whispered. But just as they rose to gather their things, a faint sound froze them in place, a whisper, soft yet unmistakable, calling each of their names. The story seemed to end, but their night had only just begun. Outside, the trees swayed violently, though there was no breeze. The forest seemed to hum with life, and from deep within, faint footsteps echoed toward the camp.